Welcome to the special guest host series of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, where I'm going to be handing over the mic to some incredible guest hosts. In each episode, you'll hear fresh perspectives and unique insights to inform and inspire you, and all the while, keeping the heart of this podcast alive. So sit back and enjoy.
Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am Alisa Zipursky, and I am so thrilled to be guest hosting this week's episode. I am here with Emmy Nietfeld. Emmy is an independent journalist, a speaker, and an author of Acceptance, a critically acclaimed memoir that chronicles her journey through mental health systems, the foster care system, and homelessness. In addition, she writes about inequality, health, and families for places like The Cut, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and so much more. Emmy lives in Manhattan with her family, and recently her latest piece was just published this week in Mother Jones, and it's entitled What the Most Famous Book About Trauma Gets Wrong, and it exposes a backlash against Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. Emmy, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm so happy to be here, Alisa.
So let's kick it off by telling folks a little bit more about this article, because as we're recording this, it's only been out for 2 days. And I'm sure some listeners haven't gotten a chance to get their hands on it yet.
So for Mother Jones, I wrote a story that's called What the Most Famous Book About Trauma Gets Wrong. And it is about The Body Keeps the Score, which is Bessel van der Kolk's runaway bestseller. It's sold over 3 million copies worldwide and is pretty much the ubiquitous book about trauma. If you are a survivor who is looking for help, like, this is the book you're going to find. I found this book when I sought therapy after a sexual assault and a really crappy childhood. And everybody told me, you have to read this book. And I did read it. I read it so fast. I found it very compelling. And there were parts of it that were really disturbing to me in ways that I couldn't exactly pinpoint until a couple years later when I saw this Twitter thread that really called out the book. And it inspired me to go back and reread it. And the things that it said about survivors really shocked me, like talking about people in some pretty disrespectful ways. And I ended up pitching this story. It went to Mother Jones. And then I started talking to experts. And the things that I found were even more surprising than what's actually in the text of the book.
And I just have to say straight off the bat, as a survivor advocate and a childhood sexual abuse survivor who everything I do is just about supporting survivors and the people who love us, thank you for writing this piece. It feels long overdue. I have had so many CSA survivors in particular send me emails, send me messages telling me they read The Body Keeps the Score and they feel worse off than before they read it. And they think that something's wrong with them because they don't see themselves in those pages. And I think that that's a really important cultural impact of this book on survivors. Is, I too read it looking for support, having been recommended to me by too many people to count. And I read it at a really tender time, and it left me, I couldn't finish it. It left me feeling so stigmatized, so pathologized, like I was doomed to this lifetime of totally dysfunctional relationships, all these terrible health outcomes, and that there wasn't really much I could do to change that. And I thought, well, that's not me. I'm not the way he describes girls who've experienced CSA. So either am I not a real survivor, or I am, and I've just been in denial about how messed up I am. And I think, that's a really important aspect of talking about anything that has the cultural dominance that this book has had, is that folks read it, and if it doesn't resonate with them or they find it harmful, they don't think, what's wrong with this text? They think, what's wrong with me?
Man, That is such a good point. And one of the things that comes up with this book too that experts told me about is that even if a particular person hasn't read the book, if they go to therapy, there's a very good chance that their therapist might have read this book and might have potentially read it on critically without getting other perspectives, without really evaluating the evidence, and then might be actually steering people away from the treatment that is most likely to help them fast, help them effectively because of the book. And that is absolutely what happened to me with the therapist who suggested it. And it just became a very interesting question of like, why is nobody challenging this book? And rereading it, I was like, did people even read what's here? Like it reads like it was written 100 years ago in some ways, in my opinion.
Let's get into some of that. So I think, I want us to talk about the way survivors are discussed in this book. But before we even get into that, what I really want to talk about is the science that's presented in this book and what you found as in doing research for this book and speaking with scientific experts whose work Bessel van der Kolk cites frequently in the book, and to find that it wasn't just the sort of stigmatizing language that's used, but in fact that there our medical inaccuracies in the book was truly very surprising to me.
Yeah, it is. It's obviously a very complex topic, and I am not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a journalist and a writer. And so when I started reporting the piece, I made a list of who are the experts that I should talk to about this. And one name kept coming up. Her name is Jenny Knoll, and she is one of the world-renowned researchers on child sexual abuse. And so I was reading her a passage from the book, and it describes a girl named Aisha who lives at a group home. She has run away from her group home and she was gang raped again. She has previously been raped. And the story about her, it came right after this section that, if I can read a few quotes from it.
Please.
Yeah. So van der Kolk, he paints this really damning picture of sexually abused girls. He's citing a big study, and he says these girls, they don't have friends of either gender. They hate themselves and their biology is against them. Other kids usually don't want anything to do with them. They are simply too weird. So I was speaking to this researcher, Jenny Knoll, and I was like, well, what do you think about this assessment? Do you think that this is accurate, fair? What's your take? And she was like, oh my God, this is awful. This is not the norm. And this is also a very disrespectful way to be talking about any group of people, and particularly a group of people who have been victimized like this. And the conversation was just so stark to me that it made me wonder, okay, if this is how she feels, how would the researcher who did this study feel about the way that their work was presented? And so I was like, next, I'm going to interview that person. I went to the footnote, and Jenny Knoll was the author of that paper.
Kidding.
And he had been summarizing her work. She's one of 3 authors, but, he had been summarizing the work that she worked on. And when I called her back and was like,
my God,
I have something to tell you, that passage, that was your study. She was totally shocked. She was like, this totally misrepresents it. And it led me to then go through the passages where he's talking about sexual assault survivors, particularly marginalized ones, and just read carefully what are the footnotes he's citing, and do the papers there match up with the claims in the book.
Wow.
And I found that, I was looking at a very small portion of the book, like really just a couple pages. It's a very long book. But in that, I found, some of the citations, they do not match what the claim is. And so there was one claim that that traumatized children have 50 times the rate of asthma as non-traumatized children. And I had read the book multiple times, just like gone past that. And then I was like, that's a really big number. That would mean that if like 100% of traumatized children have asthma, only at most 2% of non-traumatized children could have asthma. And I was like, does that math? And then I went and he was citing the a Jenny Knoll paper.
Yet
The
again.
paper did, yeah, the paper did not mention asthma, did not mention breathing. And I asked her and she's like, we have never published on asthma.
So
And
just to
Vanderkolk did. Oh, yeah. I will say, I ended up speaking with Vanderkolk and he said, like sometimes he uses data that is not published. But like this 50x number, it's not in line with what other papers say. Not at all. There is an association, but it's like 2x, maybe even 4x or 5x, but 50x is very, very big.
Yeah, and it's huge. And I actually remember reading that statistic years ago when I first read the book, and I was like, oh shit, like do I have asthma and not realize it? Like, it was just one of a plethora of things that were presented to me as a CSA survivor that really confused me about myself at a time where, like so many other survivors, I was like, and can I really claim this? Like, do I really, there was so much invalidation and self-doubt that I was navigating. The passage you read earlier about how we as girl CSA survivors, we hate ourselves and we can't have functioning friendships. And like, yes, this happened to me, but as I repeatedly tell my fantastic trauma therapist, I have always suffered from high self-esteem. And pride myself since I was very small on the friendships that I have. And so I just, I am at sort of a loss for how female survivors are categorized and described in the book. Are there more examples that come to mind for you about the way they're spoken about? And I'm curious also, in your reread of the book, about the difference between the way boy and girl survivors are spoken about, because I remember quite vividly that only girl survivors' sexuality was discussed in the book. And I remember I kept hearing about quote unquote hypersexuality, which, by the way, what does that even mean? And what does it mean that medical experts are deciding what is and isn't normal for a teenage girl to do with her body sexually? But I remember noticing that discrepancy. So I'm just curious, with your journalistic eyes, then reading it in a journalistic perspective, what struck you reading it that second time?
Well, first of all, on the friends topic, so his quotes about not having friends, they cite this long 30-year study where Jenny Knoll was one of the researchers. And when I was putting together the piece, I wanted to do a story saying, it's like there's no evidence that these girls don't have friends. And Jenny Knoll was like, you can't say that because that's not true. They did a paper comparing friendships between the cohort of sexually abused girls and the cohort of girls who had not experienced sexual abuse. And they had the same number of peers and they had the same quality of peer relationships. So actually the whole friendship thing totally contradicts the data that was published. So that is like one example. And I think that another interesting piece, like looking at how the book is framed, is really going back to the very beginning. Like in the opening pages, we meet Tom, who is a retired Marine. Yeah, it's like one of the most infamous examples from the book because this is how it leads. This is what sets the tone. And Tom was a Vietnam War veteran. He watched many of his friends die or become seriously injured, which was clearly, a horrible thing. And then he went on a rampage and he raped a woman. He murdered a farmer. He murdered local children, basically committing war crimes. And yet there's no regard paid whatsoever to these victims. And instead, it is about him and like, how is he going to look his wife in the face knowing that he brutally raped a woman who looked just like her? And I think as a survivor, it feels very uncentering, right? To be like, okay, am I like that guy?
Yes.
And I don't want to say, oh, he's a bad person or anything like that. Like clearly he was a trauma survivor too, I guess, but to lead the book with that, it really feels like, okay, this book is for an intended audience, and that intended audience was not me.
Absolutely. And I remember exactly where I was sitting in my old apartment reading that and realizing that at no point did Vander Kolk expect us to identify with the woman who was raped, or the community that is terrorized and permanently traumatized by this behavior. And we're supposed to identify with Tom. And all that left me with was being terrified of myself and thinking that I was somehow contaminated and contagious. And I will have to say, I have to say that it was so stigmatizing to me. It is one of the many things, frankly, that I had to work through in deciding to become a parent this last year. You and I both became moms in the last 11 months. And this idea that because I have experienced trauma, that somehow I am contagious and capable of doing all of this in the name of having been traumatized felt just profoundly harmful.
Yeah, totally. I had never really thought about that angle, but it feels really, really true to me, and I think it's almost a truism in our society today, this whole thing of hurt people hurt people. And I do think that The Body Keeps the Score has really played into that, in setting up trauma not only as something that can happen to you when you are violated, but that you can even become traumatized by raping and murdering other people. Your own actions can traumatize you. That is how he frames the story of Tom. And I find that extremely harmful because it removes agency for people's actions, and it puts victims and perpetrators on the same plane. And maybe sure, there's some humanistic reason why, Jesus loves us all if you're Christian, whatever. But when you're a victim and you're going in and you're like, hey, this person did this horrible thing to me. I don't know about you or other people, but I already really identified with my perpetrator, despite the horrible, awful things he did to me that I would never, ever do to anybody else. That is something that's so common among victims. And if you are writing a book about trauma, you should know that.
Well, certainly. And I think, I recognize that The Body Keeps Score was the intended audience was not necessarily survivors. It's what it's become. But I also think there is so much language of inevitability in that book that is deeply concerning to me. And it brings me to want to ask you, we're having this conversation about this book that it's actually quite difficult to wrap our heads around just how popular for how long it's been. The statistic that stands out to me, it has spent so far a total of 6 years on the New York Times bestseller list combined. And yet I would imagine that any sort of popular scientific theory that would be, placed in pop culture the way The Body Keeps the Score has, would have there'd be a whole body of cultural and scientific criticism around it. Just like it would if it was anything else that somebody was presenting that was this popular. And it makes me want to ask you, what do you think it is about this culture of silence around talking about The Body Keeps the Score, about talking about Bessel van der Kolk too? Because, I have been in these circles where we have said it to each other for years, but there is still this palpable fear that some clinicians have, some scientists and some survivors have of being able to talk about that this is a flawed piece of work. Frankly, all pieces of work are. And yet we're not really supposed to publicly have discourse about that.
Yeah. I think there's a couple reasons. I think the first one is that Bessel van der Kolk is very, very successful. And this book is very successful, right? And especially academia, it's a world where you cannot piss people off who are in power. And along the way, I did speak to people who previously worked for Bessel van der Kolk, but I had to keep it completely off the record because they were afraid of professional repercussions. And since the piece has come out, even though it's been like less than 72 hours, I've received so many emails from therapists and psychology professors who are like, thank you for writing this. This is what we've like been talking about for years. I also think part of why it's hard to criticize the book is because of its utility for people, right?
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of people do read the book and they feel like it helps them, and
Yeah.
I think that's great for them. I think a lot of people, they don't even read the book. They just see the nice cover and they hear the title and they buy the book and they keep the book like to read someday. And, I think that it is so successful in so many ways as a book and it deserves credit for that, right?
Yeah.
Like what a beautiful cover. What a great title. Like you don't even have to read the book to get the gist of it.
To get something out of it. Yeah. And I think that's such an important piece to it because I have to acknowledge that for as much as I personally found the book stigmatizing, at the same time, the book and its popularity allowed for other people to understand me better. While I found it personally stigmatizing, it actually destigmatized me to other people in a sense because I did not have clear narrative memories of my abuse. And that is something a lot of people have come to understand is the way that trauma can work because of how popular this book is. And, it's interesting because it's like, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's so important that this book has brought a better understanding to us about how trauma can work in the body and the mind. And it's not the way we see it on TV. And frankly, it's not the way that a lot of therapists, psychiatrists have been telling us it necessarily works for decades. And at the same time, for me, what is so frustrating is that this book, to van der Kolk's credit, he didn't design this book to be the answer to everything. It became the way culturally we're like, oh, you have trauma, you're traumatized by the pandemic, you're traumatized by an individual, like read this book. And so it wasn't necessarily, his intention for it to become the be all end all of answers. And frankly, it became a huge motivator for why I wrote my book, Healing Honestly, which is a survivor to survivor guide to healing from childhood sexual abuse. And I told both my literary agent and my editor on our first days of working together, I said, listen, I'm writing this book because people need to stop recommending The Body Keeps the Score to CSA survivors. And we need another option that's written by survivors. And the experts in the book, including the medical experts, are survivors. And so I want to create a space to acknowledge that he didn't write it to become the trauma Bible. Or did he?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I just don't want to assume anybody's intention here, right?
I think that's fair.
Certainly he said that in interviews, right?
Okay, so let's Okay, so let's not talk in assuming people's frames of mind. Let's talk in facts. Let's talk about the facts that have been very quietly spoken about Bessel van der Kolk himself and his dismissal from his own trauma center. I want to hear about the reporting you did around this, whether things got cut from the piece. What did you learn from also interviewing him himself around his dismissal and what really happened there?
So one of the pieces of the van der Kolk story is that in 2018, the executive director of the Trauma Center, which is the organization that Bessel van der Kolk founded, he was dismissed for sexual misconduct. He was dismissed by the parent organization of the Trauma Center called the Justice Resource Institute. A point that van der Kolk, makes clear that it wasn't him. So then shortly after, Bessel van der Kolk himself was also dismissed by the Justice Resource Institute from the Trauma Center, which was the organization he founded. And there was a lawsuit, they settled all of that. But he was, the claims were that he was dismissed for harassing, or maybe not harassing, bullying. I believe that the term was bullying, and denigrating employees. And I think that that's pretty relevant when you're talking about a book about trauma, where there's a power dynamic at work.
Yeah.
And, how are
And a
people
lot of workplaces replicate the trauma that we experience.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think there's been some really good original reporting in like the Boston Globe about that. Like I don't really have new things to share here, but I did speak to Vander Kolk. Unfortunately, I spoke to him too late in the process. I would love to, I got some really interesting information from him that I would love to share at another time. But he told me that when he was fired, he had been on sabbatical and didn't really know what happened with Spinazzola, who was the executive director. And that was some new information because I have read most of the news articles about these firings, and I've never seen before that he was on sabbatical. And so, but there were so many things that we couldn't get into it. And like, if I wish I had talked to him so much earlier because, he has such a distinctive voice and distinctive opinions. And, I asked him directly about this question of like, how do you feel about when survivors read this book and then say that they found it pathologizing, right? They said that they feel like you're treating people who have PTSD as like being irrevocably harmed. And what he told me is, here's the quote: "When you have PTSD, you do very self-destructive and difficult things, and you make people around you unhappy. So yes, it is a bad condition to have." And then he added, "You can say, oh, everything is wonderful. You just happen to be destroyed inside."
Well, I'm glad to know that. I had no idea I was destroyed inside. That's so helpful to hear from the foremost trauma expert in the world. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad to learn this about myself.
Yeah, it was an interesting, it kind of caught me off guard with its frankness, right? Because I feel like when I read the book, I kind of got those overtones, and then it was like, okay, this is how, this is what he says about it. This is how he feels. And one of the things when we were talking about some of the facts that people disagree with, or one of the things is around treatment and like what kinds of treatment work. And, I think this book for a lot of people has opened up new ideas of how they could deal with their PTSD or complex PTSD, right?
Certainly,
like maybe
it introduced me to EMDR. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. And EMDR is like backed by like quite a bit of evidence now that like it seems very, very effective, right? Like one of the best treatments. But then some of the other treatments like exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, they're kind of these CBT therapies. Vander Kolk takes a very, very negative view on them. And to the like really saying like, they do not work, and giving some statistics that I did not feel matched what the actual studies said. And so one of the people who wrote one of the studies that was cited for like, this does not work, he told me that like, actually, I think cognitive behavioral therapy as a first line treatment is one of the best treatments for PTSD. And so like the actual researchers who Vander Kolk cites, I went and I talked to them, and then the piece is like filled with these quotes. And so I think it's really important for people to get the most accurate information so that they can make the decisions for themselves, and therapists too, right? So that you're not, if this is what you see and you're not really looking into it deeply, you might tell people, I don't think cognitive behavioral therapy is going to work for you. Like, I don't even think you should try it. When that's not really what the data
And that's what
shows,
you
in my
personally
opinion.
experienced in your treatment with your first therapist.
Yeah, exactly. Like I have really had the full gamut of therapy experiences in my life. I've had some very, very harmful cognitive behavioral therapy. I had some great cognitive behavioral therapy. And my experience with this book is that the therapist who recommended it and who basically followed the playbook, I felt so ashamed. I had so much additional baggage that I had to work through because she was basically like, you shouldn't talk about what happened to you. She said it will re-traumatize you and it will make you worse. And when I was like, what is the data for that? She was like, this is what the body keeps the score says. And then I read the book and that's basically what it says. And so I just went farther and farther into my shell. And I did pull up the papers then. Like I just Googled what works for PTSD, and I happened to find prolonged exposure therapy. And I ended up entering a research study as a subject, and I received it that way. But there were like months or maybe years of trying to undo the damage that this therapist caused me, citing Van der Kolk along the way.
And so I think that personal experience that I just have to note also forever the journalist then goes directly to the citations and the sources and receiving that feedback from her therapist, which I love that you did. I think that leads us sort of perfectly to my last question for you, which is, what do you think needs to shift about the culture around the body keeps the score?
I would love it if people recognize both the benefits of the book and its drawbacks. Like clearly it is doing a lot of work for certain people and being really helpful to them. And also I don't think people should be recommending it to everybody who's been through trauma. Like particularly women who are victims of sexual trauma, particularly people who are marginalized in some way, right? I just would be really aware of that. A lot of people of color, particularly people who are Vietnamese, are like, they read the initial pages with the story of Tom, and that in and of themselves is so damaging. So I think that there should just be greater awareness there. And I really do believe we need to have better representations of healing that are written by survivors for survivors. Like clearly your book, Healing Honestly, maybe my book, Acceptance, where I talk about all the things, childhood, I was homeless for a while. I was in foster care. I was, sexually assaulted, neglected, everything, all the things. And I write about it and the challenges of traditional therapy, of CBT, of just how do you work your way through that? And I think that there also is really a dearth of representation of these like frontline gold star therapies, right? Like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy. There's just like not really representations anywhere. I would say like the only real pop culture one is the 10 sessions episode of This American Life, which goes through cognitive processing therapy. And you hear the recordings of the writer as she's going through it. And so I think that there needs to be more of those. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm right here with you. I mean, I am a firm believer that we need to be listening to survivors and that survivors are the experts in their own safety and their own healing. And we need resources that trust us, that teach us to trust ourselves, that teach us to listen to our own intuition, that teach us how to tap into our own power that's always been there, but has been silenced by rape culture and the world around us. And the more that we can center those resources, I think the better off all of us will be. And so, I just want to say thank you so much for your labor in writing this piece and finding a home for it. In doing all of this research, I think that this piece is very important. And I know that the legacy of it will just continue to grow and grow.
Thank you so much, Alisa. This has been so wonderful to get to talk about it more and talk about it with, a fellow sexual assault survivor. And I hope that it helps other people. and helps therapists too. Yeah.
So everybody who's listening, please go to Mother Jones and read What the Most Famous Book About Trauma Gets Wrong. Thank you, Emmy, so much for being with us. And thank you to Guy McPherson for giving us the opportunity and the platform to have this conversation.
Thank you.